The laughter stopped mid-sentence. Jimmy Fallon froze with his coffee mug halfway to his lips, his signature smile dissolving as he processed what he just heard. The Tonight Show studio, normally buzzing with infectious energy, fell into a silence so profound you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. 300 audience members held their breath. The Roots stopped their subtle background rhythm. Even the camera operator seemed to pause, unsure whether to keep rolling. It was supposed to be a lighthearted segment about funny classroom moments. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old high school English teacher from Newark, New Jersey, had been invited on the show to share some amusing stories about her students' creative excuses and unexpected wisdom. She'd been charming the audience for 10 minutes with tales of teenagers who thought Shakespeare invented texting abbreviations and students who tried to turn in essays written entirely in emojis. The studio was everything you'd expect from The Tonight Show. Bright blue and gold lighting cast a warm glow across the iconic desk and guest chairs. The New York skyline twinkled through the massive windows behind Jimmy's desk, creating that perfect late-night television atmosphere. The audience, a mix of tourists and locals, had been laughing and applauding on cue, fully engaged in what seemed like a typical feel-good segment. Sarah sat in the guest chair wearing a simple navy blazer she'd bought at a thrift store specifically for this appearance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal makeup, partly by choice and partly because she couldn't afford the expensive cosmetics she saw other guests wearing in the green room. But her eyes sparkled with genuine passion when she talked about her students, and that authenticity had immediately connected with both Jimmy and the audience. So these kids, Sarah was saying, gesturing expressively, they thought Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy was actually a really deep tweet that went viral in the 1600s. One student asked me if Shakespeare had a blue check mark. The audience erupted in laughter, and Jimmy slapped his desk in his characteristic way. "That's incredible," Jimmy chuckled, shaking his head. "I love how their minds work. It's like they're trying to make sense of the past through their present reality." "Exactly," Sarah's face lit up. "That's what I love most about teaching teenagers. They see connections we adults miss. Like last week, one of my students compared Romeo and Juliet to a Netflix series that got canceled too early. He said, 'Miss Chen, if they just had better communication and maybe some couples therapy, we could have had at least 3 more seasons.'" The laughter was infectious. Jimmy was in his element, playing off Sarah's stories with perfect timing. This was the kind of segment that made The Tonight Show special. Those moments where ordinary people became temporary stars, sharing their unique perspectives with a national audience. "But seriously," Jimmy said, leaning forward with genuine interest, "what keeps you motivated? Teaching is such a challenging profession, especially in today's world. What makes you want to get up every morning and face 30 teenagers who think Shakespeare had social media?" Sarah's smile flickered for just a moment, something subtle that only Jimmy caught. She glanced down at her hands, then back up at Jimmy with what looked like forced brightness. "Oh, you know," she said, her voice slightly less steady than before. "They're amazing kids, really. They just need someone to believe in them, to show them that their stories matter too. A lot of my students come from backgrounds where education isn't always prioritized, where they're told they're not college material. But when you see a kid who's been written off by everyone else suddenly understand metaphor, or when they write a poem that makes you cry," she trailed off, her voice catching slightly. Jimmy sensed the shift immediately. Years of hosting had given him an almost supernatural ability to read his guests' emotional states. Something in Sarah's tone, the way her shoulders had tensed, told him there was more to this story. "That must be incredibly rewarding," he said gently, his voice losing some of its performative energy. "But also challenging. I imagine it takes a lot out of you, giving so much of yourself to your students." Sarah nodded, and for a moment, the mask slipped. The carefully maintained composure that had carried her through the first part of the interview began to crack. She looked out at the audience, then back at Jimmy, and something in her expression had changed. "It does," she said quietly. "It takes everything." The studio audience sensed the mood shift. The laughter had died down, replaced by an attentive silence. Jimmy set down his coffee mug and leaned forward, his full attention focused on Sarah. "Everything?" he asked softly, and something in his tone suggested he understood that this wasn't just about emotional energy anymore. Sarah's hands trembling slightly in her lap. She'd been holding this inside for months, carrying the weight of it alone, and suddenly, sitting under these bright lights with Jimmy Fallon looking at her with such genuine concern, the walls she'd built around her pride and her pain began to crumble. She started, then stopped. She looked at the audience, at the cameras, at Jimmy's kind face. This wasn't what she'd planned to talk about. She'd come here to promote her students' poetry anthology, to share some laughs, to maybe inspire other teachers. But the question had opened something she couldn't close. "I spend my own grocery money on school supplies," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Every month. I budget $40 for food for myself, and I spend $60 on pencils and notebooks and printer paper for my classroom." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Jimmy's expression shifted completely, the entertainer's mask falling away to reveal something much more human underneath. "Sarah," he said quietly, and his voice carried a weight that transcended television. "The school gives us a budget of $50 per semester for supplies," she continued, the floodgates now open. $50 for 30 kids. Do you know how much paper 30 teenagers go through? How many pens they lose? How many books fall apart because they're held together with tape and hope? The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something raw and real happening in front of them. "So I use my own money," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger even as tears began to form in her eyes. "I eat ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches so my kids can have fresh notebooks. I wear the same 3 blazers in rotation because I spent my clothing budget on books for our classroom library. I haven't been to a movie or out to dinner in over a year because every extra dollar goes to my students." Jimmy's hands had formed fists in his lap, not from anger at Sarah, but from a growing rage at a system that had put this dedicated woman in such an impossible position. His jaw was tight, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 7 years, Sarah replied. "Ever since I started teaching. And I'm not the only one. Every teacher I know does the same thing. We joke about it in the break room, about living on crackers and coffee so our kids can learn. But it's not really funny, is it?" Behind the scenes, something unprecedented was happening. The show's producers, who normally managed every segment with military precision, had stopped giving directions. The director, watching through the monitors in the control room, made a decision that would define this moment. He signaled to keep the cameras rolling, to capture whatever was about to happen next. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews unless it was planned. He walked around to where Sarah sat, and without asking permission, without considering the cameras or the audience or the format of his show, he knelt down beside her chair. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but picked up clearly by his wireless microphone, "look at me." She turned to face him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, a simple white square of fabric that he offered to her. "You are not alone in this," he said, and every person in that studio could hear the absolute sincerity in his voice. "What you're doing, the sacrifice you're making for your students, that's not just teaching, that's heroic." "I don't feel heroic," Sarah whispered. "I feel tired. I feel like I'm failing them because I can't do more." "You're not failing anyone," Jimmy said firmly. "The system is failing you. Society is failing you. But you're doing something extraordinary." He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Then he turned to address the studio audience directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that transformed the entire atmosphere of the show. This is Sarah Chen. She's an English teacher from Newark, New Jersey. She has a master's degree in education and 7 years of experience molding young minds. She works 60-hour weeks, spends her own money on supplies for her students, and lives on basically nothing so that 30 teenagers can learn about Shakespeare and poetry and the power of their own voices. The audience began to respond, a low murmur of recognition and support rippling through the crowd. "And you know what?" Jimmy continued, his voice growing stronger. "She's not unique. There are thousands of teachers across this country doing exactly the same thing, going without so their students can have, sacrificing their own comfort, their own financial security, their own well-being for the education of our children." He paused, looking directly into the main camera. "We live in a country where teachers have to choose between eating dinner and buying pencils for their students, where educators with advanced degrees work second jobs just to afford rent, where the people we trust with our most precious resource, our children, are treated like they don't matter." The studio was electric now, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with truth being spoken in a place where truth wasn't always welcome. Jimmy turned back to Sarah, who was watching him with amazement and gratitude. "Sarah," he said, "how much would it cost to properly supply your classroom for a full year?" Sarah looked confused by the question. I don't know. I've never been able to think that big. Maybe $2,000 for everything we really need?" Jimmy nodded, then reached into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out his personal checkbook, the one he kept for emergencies and special occasions. Under the bright studio lights, with 300 people watching and millions more at home, he began to write. The scratching of pen on paper was audible in the silence. When he finished, he tore out the check and handed it to Sarah. "This is for $5,000, he said. "Not for you personally, but for your classroom. For supplies, for books, for whatever your students need." Sarah stared at the check, her hand shaking. "Jimmy, I can't accept this. This is too much. You can and you will," Jimmy said gently but firmly. "But that's not all." He turned back to the audience, his energy building. "NBC," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I know you're watching. Tomorrow morning, I want to have a meeting about starting a fund for teachers like Sarah. A real fund with real money that can help educators across the country." The audience erupted in applause, but Jimmy wasn't finished. "And to everyone watching at home," he continued, "if Sarah's story moves you, if you know a teacher who's struggling, who's choosing between their own needs and their students' education, do something about it. Ask them what they need. Contribute to their classroom. Because this isn't just about Sarah. This is about all of them." He knelt down beside Sarah's chair again, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "But most importantly, Sarah, I want you to stop apologizing for needing help. What you're doing matters. Your students' futures matter, and you matter." Sarah was crying openly now, but they were different tears than before. These weren't tears of frustration or exhaustion. These were tears of relief, of being seen, of being valued. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the money, but for making people understand." Jimmy smiled, that genuine smile that had made him beloved by millions, but somehow more real than his audience had ever seen it. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding all of us what dedication looks like, what love in action really means." He stood and helped Sarah to her feet. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, he took off his suit jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "This jacket," he said, "has been with me through every Tonight Show I've ever hosted. It's seen celebrities and politicians and athletes. But tonight, it's going home with a real hero." The standing ovation began in the front row and spread through the entire studio like wildfire. But this wasn't the polite, manufactured applause of television. This was something organic, something real, something that came from deep in the chest of every person who had ever struggled to make ends meet, who had ever sacrificed for someone else, who had ever felt unseen in their dedication. As the applause continued, Jimmy walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, his hands resting on its surface, and spoke directly into the camera. "We'll be right back after this break," he said. "But before we go, I want to say something." Sarah Chen came on this show tonight to talk about funny student stories. Instead, she gave us something much more valuable. She gave us the truth about what it costs to care, about what it means to put others before yourself, about what real heroism looks like. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. If you're a teacher watching this, know that you're seen, you're appreciated, and you're not alone. If you're a parent, hug a teacher. If you're a student, thank a teacher. And if you're a human being with the power to make a difference in education, use it. The show went to commercial, but something had shifted fundamentally in that studio. The audience members were talking to each other, sharing their own stories about teachers who had impacted their lives. The crew was wiping their eyes. Even the usually stoic security guards were moved. During the break, Jimmy sat with Sarah, who was still wearing his jacket and clutching the check. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Jimmy said, "you go back to your classroom and you buy those supplies and you keep changing lives. But you also start taking care of yourself. Because if we're going to change this system, we need teachers like you, healthy and strong and fighting." "I don't know how to fight a system," Sarah said. "You've been fighting it every day for 7 years," Jimmy replied. "You just didn't realize that's what you were doing. Every time you chose your students over yourself, every time you found a way to make magic happen with no resources, every time you saw potential in a kid others had given up on, that was fighting." When the show returned from commercial, Jimmy's next guest was a famous actor promoting his latest movie. But the energy in the room had changed. The conversation was deeper, more meaningful. The actor, who had been backstage during Sarah's segment, spoke about his own high school English teacher who had encouraged him to pursue acting when everyone else told him he wasn't talented enough. The ripple effects of Sarah's appearance began immediately. Before the show even finished airing, NBC had received hundreds of calls and emails from viewers wanting to contribute to teacher support funds. Social media exploded with the hashtag #TeachersLikeSarah, with people sharing stories of educators who had made a difference in their lives. 3 weeks later, Jimmy announced the launch of the Tonight Show Teacher Support Fund with an initial contribution of $100,000 from the show and its sponsors. Within 6 months, it had raised over $2 million, providing supplies, resources, and direct financial support to teachers across the country. Sarah returned to her classroom the Monday after her appearance with more supplies than she'd ever had access to. But more importantly, she returned with a renewed sense of purpose and the knowledge that her sacrifices hadn't gone unnoticed. Her students, who had watched the show over the weekend, greeted her with handmade signs and a standing ovation of their own. "Thank you for choosing us," one of their posters read. "We choose you too." In the months that followed, Sarah's story became a catalyst for broader conversations about education funding, teacher compensation, and the value society places on educators. She was invited to speak at conferences, to meet with legislators, to share her experience with other teachers who felt isolated in their struggles. But perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah herself. She learned to accept help without shame, to advocate for her needs and the needs of her profession, and to see her daily sacrifices not as failures, but as acts of love. Jimmy kept in touch with Sarah, checking in periodically to see how she was doing. On the 1-year anniversary of her appearance, he surprised her by showing up at her school unannounced, bringing lunch for the entire faculty, and spending the afternoon reading to her students. "You started something that night," he told her as they sat in her newly equipped classroom. "You reminded people that teachers are human beings with real struggles and real needs. That changed everything. "I was just trying to answer your question honestly," Sarah replied. "And that honesty changed the world," Jimmy said. "At least for the teachers who got help because of it. At least for the students who have better resources because someone heard your story and decided to act." The Tonight Show segment with Sarah Chen became one of the most watched and most shared clips in the show's history. Not because of its entertainment value, but because of its humanity. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful television happens when the script is thrown away and real people are allowed to tell real stories. Sarah still teaches at the same high school in Newark. She still cares deeply about her students, still goes the extra mile to ensure they have what they need to succeed. But now she does it with the support of a community that sees and values her work. And sometimes, late at night when she's grading papers in her well-stocked classroom, she looks at Jimmy's jacket hanging on her desk chair and remembers the moment when her struggle became visible, when her sacrifice was acknowledged, when her worth was recognized. It wasn't just a talk show appearance. It was the night education got a voice, and that voice belonged to a teacher who was brave enough to tell the truth. 5 years later, Sarah Chen stood before the United States Senate Education Committee wearing a navy blazer remarkably similar to the one she'd worn on The Tonight Show. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her sat dozens of teachers from across the country, each with their own story of sacrifice, each carrying the hope that their voices would finally be heard at the highest levels of government. "Senators," Sarah began, her voice steady and confident in a way that would have surprised her younger self. "I'm here today not just as Sarah Chen, a teacher from Newark, but as a representative of the millions of educators who choose their students' needs over their own every single day." The committee room was different from Jimmy's studio. Marble columns and mahogany panels replaced bright lights and cameras. But the essence remained the same. People in positions of influence listening to a teacher tell her truth. 5 years ago, I appeared on The Tonight Show to share some funny stories about my students. Instead, I ended up confessing that I was spending my grocery money on school supplies. That confession changed my life, but more importantly, it started a conversation about what we really value in this country. Senator Patricia Hawkins, the committee chair, leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, can you elaborate on the systemic changes you've observed since your television appearance?" Sarah smiled, thinking of her current classroom, now fully stocked thanks to the ongoing support from the Tonight Show Fund and countless individual donors who had been moved by her story. "Senator, the immediate impact was extraordinary. Within weeks of my appearance, our school received donations that transformed not just my classroom, but our entire English department. Students who had been sharing decade-old textbooks suddenly had access to current literature. Kids who had never owned a new book went home with novels they could call their own." She paused, looking at the faces of the senators, some engaged, others checking their phones. But the real change happened in how teachers began to see themselves. For years, we'd accepted that self-sacrifice was just part of the job. We wore our financial struggles like badges of honor, competing over who could do more with less. The Tonight Show moment made us realize that our struggles weren't noble, they were unnecessary. Behind Sarah, Jennifer Martinez, a math teacher from Phoenix, nodded in recognition. Next to her, David Kim from rural Montana shifted in his seat, remembering his own journey from silence to advocacy. The Teacher Support Fund that grew from that appearance has now assisted over 50,000 educators nationwide, Sarah continued. But more than the financial support, it created a network. Teachers who had felt isolated in their struggles suddenly realized they weren't alone. We started talking to each other, sharing resources, and most importantly, demanding better. Senator Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, interrupted. "Ms. Chen, while these private donations are admirable, shouldn't teachers be advocating for better salaries rather than relying on charity?" Sarah's eyes flashed with the passion that had made her such an effective educator. "Senator, with respect, we've been advocating for fair compensation for decades. We've held rallies, contacted representatives, and joined unions. But systemic change takes time, and our students can't wait. When a child doesn't have a textbook today, they can't learn today. When a teacher chooses between rent and classroom supplies this month, it affects students this month." She stood up, her voice gaining strength. "The donations and support we've received aren't charity, Senator. They're investments. Investments in education that our government has failed to make adequately." In the gallery, Jimmy Fallon sat quietly, having come to support Sarah's testimony. He thought back to that night 5 years ago, when he'd knelt beside her chair, when he'd written that first check. Neither of them could have imagined it would lead to this moment. After the hearing, as Sarah walked down the Capitol steps, she felt her phone buzz. A text from Jimmy. "Proud of you. You're still changing the world, one truth at a time." She smiled, thinking of her students back in Newark, many of whom were now in college thanks partly to the opportunities that had opened up after that fateful night on television. Marcus, who had written that brilliant Romeo and Juliet analysis, was now studying journalism at Rutgers. Aaliyah, whose poetry had moved Sarah to tears, had just been accepted to Columbia. That evening, Sarah returned to her hotel room and video called her current class. It was past 9 p.m. on the East Coast, but she knew many of them would still be awake, working on the assignment she'd given them before leaving for Washington. "Miss Chen," came a chorus of voices as 28 faces appeared on her laptop screen. "How did it go?" "It went well," Sarah said, settling into her chair. "I told them about you, about how brilliant and capable and deserving you are, about how investing in your education isn't just good for you, it's good for all of us." "Did you wear the jacket?" asked Isabella, one of her seniors. Sarah laughed. "No, that jacket stays in our classroom where it belongs. It's become part of our story, part of who we are as a class." "Miss Chen," said Jamal, her most thoughtful student, "do you think things will really change because of what you said today?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Change is slow, Jamal, but it's constant. 5 years ago, I was embarrassed to admit I was struggling. Today, I stood in front of the United States Senate and demanded better for all of us. That's change." "And," she continued, looking at each of their faces on the screen, "every time one of you graduates, every time you go to college or start a career or become a parent who values education, that's change too. You are the change." After ending the call, Sarah sat in the quiet of her hotel room, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From that night of unexpected honesty on The Tonight Show to this day of intentional advocacy in the Senate, she had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about your experience. Her phone rang. It was her principal, Dr. Rodriguez. "Sarah, I just wanted you to know the district office called today. They're implementing the supply budget increase we've been requesting for 3 years. Apparently, some senators were very moved by a certain testimony they heard today." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "All classrooms? All classrooms. Every teacher in our district will have a real budget for supplies starting next semester." After hanging up, Sarah walked to her hotel window and looked out at the lights of Washington, D.C. Somewhere in this city, decisions were being made that would affect millions of students and teachers. And tonight, for the first time in her career, she felt like educators had a real voice in those decisions. The next morning, as she flew back to Newark, Sarah drafted an email to Jimmy Fallon. "Jimmy, I wanted to thank you again, not just for that night 5 years ago, but for everything that followed. You didn't just write me a check that evening. You gave me permission to believe that my voice mattered. Yesterday, I used that voice in the U.S. Senate, and today, teachers in my district will have the resources they need because of it. The ripples from that moment are still spreading, still creating change. See you next month when we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Teacher Support Fund. My students are writing you letters. P.S. Your jacket is still hanging in my classroom, still reminding us that sometimes heroes wear late-night television suits." As the plane descended toward Newark, Sarah thought about her students waiting for her return, about the lessons they would learn and the futures they would build. She thought about teachers across the country who had found their voices because she had found hers first. And she thought about Jimmy Fallon, a comedian who had taught her that the most important moments often happen when we stop performing and start being human. The story that began with a confession on late-night television had become something bigger than either of them could have imagined. It had become proof that truth-telling matters, that individual voices can create collective change, and that sometimes the most ordinary people do the most extraordinary things simply by being brave enough to speak their truth.